Let me see. Okay, so as you know, this webinar is to follow up on our global learning and knowledge development on gender and social inclusion. And this call specifically is to hear about how we can set up a community of practice. So that's an idea that actually one of the sub-programs suggested, that we can organise to be a community of peers who learn together more about our experiences and capacities in GESI-focused WASH programming. So that's the plan for the webinar today. And so without further ado, if I can also move the slides, what we're going to talk about is, after we've had a few introductions, I'll be interviewing a guest speaker. And that guest speaker is Caridwen Johnson from the Water Supply and Sanitation Collaborative Council. And Caridwen has worked a lot on different communities of practice and learning networks in the past. So today the idea is to ask her about some of her experiences and lessons learned, hints and tips about what she would suggest for really helping promote this idea of peer-to-peer group learning. Normally we would not have an external speaker on our community of practice, because that normally will be for us internally. But as this is the first one, we wanted to hear about someone else's experience first to give us some inspiration and some insights. So then next, we'll be talking about how we feel our community of practice should work. We'll have a recap on why we're doing it, what we want to do, and how we're going to achieve it. So that will be more of a conversation amongst the group. And then, of course, we'll figure out some next steps. What will we do after the call today? So, as you might recall, this community of practice is one of the activities within the whole LKD, the Learning and Knowledge Development Package that we're putting together around GESI. As you all know, because we've been speaking to you frequently, Sue and I are also doing quarterly calls with each of the sub-programs to support your learning around GESI in whichever way you best think we can help and assist. And we've been talking about learning logs and learning wheels, but also we wanted to make sure that beyond those individual sub-program calls and engagement, we have a broader group that we can bring together across the whole of the WASH SDG program. So this community of practice is that effort to try and promote that cross-learning amongst the different sub-programs and amongst the different countries working in the WASH SDG program around the world. So that's what the plan is for today. If you have any questions at any time, please feel free to type them in the chat box, which amazingly, I think Ava has managed to make bigger, which is great news. So hopefully you can all now see the contents of the chat box. Or if you want to just take the mic and jump in, that's fine too. We're a small enough group where people can take the microphone, of course, if they want to. So just let me know if you want to say anything or if you have a question. So, introductions. Ava, would you like to say a quick hello? I know you're there in the background.
Sure. Hello. Thanks, Tracy. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Ava Duarte Davidson. I'm the Consortium Program Coordinator, and I work with Sue and with Tracy on the Learning and Knowledge Development component of the program at the global level. So, yeah, great to be here and really looking forward to this community of practice.
Lovely. Thanks, Ava. Sue, do you want to say a quick hello?
Yeah, thanks Tracy and Ava. My name is Sue Cavill and I am a consultant working on GESI with the consortium. So thanks everyone for joining today and looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
Great, thanks Sue. I've introduced myself, of course, already. So this is me, Tracy, and then we've got various participants on our webinar today. If you can see the chat box, or if anybody would like to say hello, please jump in. But I can see we've got Constance, we've got Harry, we've got Jose, Ken is with us this morning, my colleague from Partnerships and Practice, we've got Lenka, Gian, Novika, oh, just going through. Sharon, good morning, everyone. Sanyas and Tamini, fabulous. And Keridwen is with us as well. Oh, sorry, I think I've managed to just move the slides. Right, here we go. So thanks, everybody. So then please do speak if you do want to take the mic, as I said. Otherwise, we can continue with the first part of the conversation, which is to talk to Keridwen Johnson, who is the Head of Governance and Membership at the Water Supply and Sanitation Collaborative Council. So hopefully, Keridwen, you can hear me, and hopefully you'll be able to speak too. Can you say hello?
Yes, hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
We can indeed. That sounds great.
Yes, you can hear.
Fabulous. Thank you. So, well, first of all, thanks for joining, Keridwen. It would be really great initially just to hear a little bit about your background and experience of managing these types of learning and knowledge management and knowledge development activities. As you just heard, we're hoping to set up our own community of practice for this WASH program, WASH SDG program, and have that focus on GESI WASH programming. So first of all, could you maybe just give us a bit of an introduction to you and your work and your experience of managing these types of activities, so that we can just figure out why are we talking to you today?
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks again for inviting me to join. Very interesting objectives I think you have around this GESI community of practice. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold, so I'm a bit croaky this morning. I'll try and be brief, because I know you also want to discuss amongst yourselves as well. Thinking about my background, I think I've been working in the sanitation, hygiene, water sector now for nearly 14 years, which came as a bit of a surprise to me. And that has actually been, as you mentioned, mainly around actually networks or partnerships, sort of collaborative group, multi-stakeholder groups. So I started with Freshwater Action Network, which some of you may know, which is a global advocacy network, particularly around civil society and community-based organizations. And certainly one of the goals of that network was learning across the network. We had hundreds of organizations all over the world, particularly in Africa, South Asia and Latin America. And so we were constantly looking at ways of how we could share and learn, and I'll get back to that later. The Sanitation and Water for All partnership I also worked for a few years, and again, you know, certainly anything with a partner, really looking at different ways that we could share the work around the advocacy plans, the results around the commitments that were being made and how that was being done in different countries. And then most recently, where I work now, the Water Supply and Sanitation Collaborative Council, which is a membership organization. And one of the objectives is also to find ways that we can connect members, that we can support members to interact with one another and to make links across countries and networks, so that people really do feel part of this global community. So that's in brief some of the experience. And one of the reflections I made when thinking about this was actually how much this work has moved on. I mean, when I started working with VAN around 14 years ago, we didn't have webinars even like this one. I mean, if they were definitely few and far between, and they weren't very effective. And I think that's worth noting that, you know, we were doing a printed publication back then and posting it. I mean, people very rarely do that now, but the objective was the same: to share updates, to share experience, to share learning, for people also to feel connected with other people working on similar issues. One of the things we did use quite effectively, which still exists, is listservs, and I think they are, you know, just email groups basically. And that's a much more obviously instant form of communication and sharing. Online emails and bulletins, obviously. But as I say, more recently, the types of activities are much more webinars like this one, online seminars, and platforms such as the Community of Practice, which we have been hosting on LinkedIn, and DGroups. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with DGroups, but basically you can have different thematic groups on email, and you sign up with an email address, and then you can share information and updates and learning around a certain theme, which it has to be managed by some sort of platform. And I know the ones I'm familiar with are managed by the Rural Water Supply Network, or is that right, or WSN. And we'll get back to this, but they all have a lead coordinator, somebody responsible for moderating that and getting people to engage. And I think that's something we'll come back to in terms of what works for different community of practices.
That's great. No, thank you, Caroline. So clearly a lot of experience working with these types of different groups, different learning groups, and in different languages and for different purposes. So as you mentioned, either for advocacy or for bringing members together, connecting them and learning together. So I'm glad we've got you online and we can pick your brains today. So from your experience, and you already started to mention a couple of the types of activities you've done, but from your experience, what do you think are some of the best ways to promote this kind of learning exchange amongst WASH groups? Like, what have you seen that seems to really work well?
Yeah, I think, again, it depends on the objectives, but I think something for this group, for example, I haven't mentioned yet, is a WhatsApp group. I mean, the Global Sanitation Fund partners in the field do a lot of real-time learning through WhatsApp. And I think that's great because you can just track things as you go, and you can send like updates on what you're doing, what you've learned, photographs, videos, and obviously in a group, in a chosen group. I'm sure you're all familiar with WhatsApp. And the other reason why I think it works well is most people seem to be on WhatsApp. I mean, all over the world now, if you have a phone. And also the other, and Facebook's the same. We also have some real-time learning groups on Facebook. And then we have the community practice on LinkedIn. And I think these work because people are already familiar with these social, the social network platforms. And you can share different types of information, as I say, and you can capture that learning quickly. Now, one thing I would say is that you still need a moderator, somebody to go into the dialogue, say once a week or once a month, and really pull out what has been shared, try and categorize the learning, capture what types of learning has come out and synthesize that, and then feed that back to the group, either through that same mechanism or maybe a different one. So, for example, you might imagine tracking some learning around different themes that you're looking at on WhatsApp, but then maybe once a month in a webinar like this, you would then feed that back. What are the key themes that are coming out, some of the key learnings, and then have a discussion. So I think the important thing is to make sure there is a moderator summarizing periodically, and that things are moderated and well coordinated. And that way, I think you can make use of the current platforms, but also have it organized and structured. One other thing I wanted to say, sorry, is just around the webinars. And we may get onto this again later, but I think of webinars a little bit like a face-to-face seminar. If we had the luxury of being able to travel around and go to conferences and attend seminars, you would imagine that a seminar would be very well planned, very well structured. The content would have been researched and very well thought through, and that you would expect to have a range of speakers and then participants that could interact in an informed way. And again, with a rapporteur, somebody that would take notes and feedback. And I think when the good webinars that I participated, like this one, but are planned in that way. And I think to get a high quality output, you really need to take the time to plan the input.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. No, really some good ideas there. So using some of the real-time social media opportunities and things like this. It's a good point about webinars being very much like a seminar, and we can take your point. The more you put in, the more you get out. So that's good to know. Thank you. And so then from these types of learning exchanges and using these platforms, have you seen people really able to actually generate knowledge, or to be able to identify knowledge gaps and then be able to fill them together? Or is it more just for connecting and sharing that you've seen the most benefit?
I think, I think looking at, I think so, for sure. I haven't mentioned yet, but the Susanna platform, I don't know if you're all members, but this is the Sustainable Sanitation Alliance now have a very well organized learning platform, and it has a number of categories, I think around 7. And I think that's why it works, because also they have a moderator, and they have structured discussions so that you can, one moderator will start a discussion, and then they'll do quite a lot of outreach to make sure people engage and, you know, share their knowledge. And then, as I say, they have a moderator summarizing it and then feeding that back. And then they also have, you can sign up to either a weekly email or daily, depending on what kind of digest you want. So that's, I think that certainly is what I would say a very good way of building learning, and where there's gaps, they call out for that. And, you know, I think identifying gaps and trying to fill them and get more people on board that have that expertise. And actually a real example of that is that with a partnership with WSCC and Susanna and the RWSN, we've just developed an 8th category in Susanna, which is around equity and inclusion. So I think many of you could be very interested in that if you haven't already looked at that. So that was really a gap that was identified that they wanted to work on, and they went to different partners to see who could really start contributing to this learning stream. And I would call all of you, once this learning gets underway, that maybe you could look at that too and bring in some of the learning from this community of practice. So that's one. On a kind of different note, we at WSCC developed a partnership with many other WASH partners that you'll know of, IRC, End Water Poverty, Sanitation Water for All, Watershed, on an accountability study. And it was a study in 26 countries, I think that was the final number, looking at what were the accountability mechanisms to report on progress around SDG 6 largely. And we interviewed a lot of stakeholders in all these countries and developed this study. And we did a series of webinars then to actually not just share recommendations, but actually bring in case studies from people, the focal points that had been working at the national level, and to talk about not what they'd learned, but also how they were bringing that learning forward into their day-to-day work and their national advocacy. And then we brought that into some toolkits for partners in those countries of how they could roll that out. So I think that's where you can have, you know, some sort of research piece, but then actually bring it to life through sharing platforms and webinars. So, so that's another example.
That's great, thank you. So really useful examples for us to hear about as well, especially this new collaboration you mentioned with RWSN and Susanna and WSSC.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll be sure to look out on that. And I know many of us are members of Susanna, so I too myself will look at this new category on equity and inclusion and will join it so that we can keep an eye on the discussions and the different webinars and editorial pieces that I think you have planned for that. So I shall make sure we make that link. And so then,
and I think just sorry, you might ask me this, Tracey, so I'm just going to sort of get ahead of you, but I think, you know, the challenge is, one of the challenges is if you don't moderate, and I think just being honest about when things don't work. I mean, we've been very much involved at WSCC of moderating the LinkedIn community of practice, and due to, let's say, lack of prioritization and capacity, it hasn't been moderated for some time. And in fact, the last time it was moderated, Tracey, you yourself were involved, I think, in a number of discussions, and you could probably share the example better than I could. And I think that worked well. But after that, it's kind of just been left, and there's 7,000 members on there, but there's nobody moderating it. And I think that's where you find that something just lays dormant, and then it won't be effective. You know, you really need to feed it, as I said earlier, and know, I think, when to let something go. And that community of practice now, I mean, the way we're pitching it is that it's no longer needed, because I think Susanna are doing a much better job and they're investing in it. And they're doing a lot of outreach and engagement in order to get high quality learning and discussion. So we've kind of made a decision that as the Susanna is such a good model and working well, that we won't try and keep 2 learning platforms going, and actually that we're inviting the members of the COP on LinkedIn to join Susanna, and sort of gradually close that one down. So I think, you know, it's worth noting that we need to recognise when things aren't working as well.
No, that's good to know, and a great piece of learning, as you said. So it's all about the moderation, being active, and providing that structure and content to convene people together, but also to, you know, as you said, the more you put in, the more you get out. So if you have the little one, but that's really interesting to hear as well. Then, so the WSSCC COP will now be part and parcel of the Susanna platform too. So. Great. Okay. No, that's good. I was going to ask you about challenges, and I shall ask you about more later on. So thank you for bringing this on in too. But it sounds as well then, using these kinds of platforms and these types of opportunities to generate knowledge and to address knowledge gaps can work well through a community like ours. So then from that, what types of products or outputs have you been able to develop and disseminate through such learning groups? Because obviously one part is having the conversations and the learning exchange and filling knowledge gaps, but have you been able to actually produce any documents or videos or other things like products from that learning to help build up the kind of knowledge base?
Yeah, I mean, I think I started, to touch on that a little bit earlier with the example of this accountability study. But, you know, and I think the product is really, you know, the written summary and circulating that back to members, which we did with that one. In addition, I think, you know, around the WSSCC COP, what we did is we surveyed a number of members on what they wanted to exchange. This is when it was working much better, had sort of instigated the dialogue, making sure that the experts and the people that were well engaged in the topic were engaging. And then we wrote written summaries of that. So you actually then have the learning outputs that come from that. So I think that's very much making sure, as I said earlier, that somebody is engaged in synthesizing and really, you know, capturing and teasing out what the key learnings are and summarizing that into a shorter document, and that would be what the output. Now, in addition to that, something I mentioned last time, as part of our partnership with UN Water, as many of you may know, they really lead quite a lot on the global milestone days like World Toilet Day, and we've been very much involved in that. And one of the things they did around World Toilet Day, which I think is relevant, is they developed an online repository. A repository is basically a place where you can store lots of information, and this information was all around the theme of World Toilet Day that year. I think it was around sustainability in WASH, and why that was important for World Toilet Day. But what they did is they asked all the partners, 22 or so, and their sort of grantees to add case studies and examples of how their work was contributing around sustainability and WASH, and then they categorized those different examples further. So what you had then was you had this a common repository online that you can go to with all the various examples. And I think that's quite an interesting way of knowing where to go to, because if you have a real-time learning platform like WhatsApp, it's great for that real time, but where do you go to then to find the examples of that learning in a sort of structured way? So that was another example that I thought might be interesting for this group.
That's great. No, thank you. So as you say, then, if you're having real-time conversations, or indeed, you know, webinars and seminars like this, we could make sure we keep the content in the same place, keep those resources together so that people can access them. So that's a great top tip. Thank you. And so then from your experience, it sounds like beyond learning and the knowledge development piece, you've used some of these learning exchanges for advocacy and kind of influencing. With us, our main audience is internal, but we do want to kind of influence each other a little bit, but we might also be inviting partners from local government or other partners to engage too. So I just thought, what's your experience of using these kinds of platforms for engaging with others and influencing others?
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly not huge, and I've sort of thought about that before. I think, I mean, if we go back to this example of a webinar being like a seminar, and that often when we engage in a conference, or whether it be in the sector or outside of the sector, and we're trying to basically share a new piece of research, some evidence around something that works, some key messages that we feel are important for a particular stakeholder group, then we would invite them to our seminar, or we might even ask them to be a speaker on the panel, to give them a voice, but then also for them to hear others and to influence them. So I guess if you're thinking of that kind of advocacy strategy, then having a webinar like this, when you're ready to share some learning, but you invite some of your targets for advocacy, that could be a very nice way, I think, of doing some advocacy around the learning that's coming out. Because I mean, I guess the thing is that you want to influence people with your learning and try and get them to adapt their programming accordingly. So that was the kind of best way. I mean, inviting them to the conversation, maybe not just webinars, but also to a D group or anything. So making sure that they're actually being exposed to the learning, and then giving them an opportunity to speak about what they've learned and what they might apply. And then I guess, the circle of advocacy, then be holding them account to whatever it is that they're committing to do, that the change they've made, thanks to the evidence and learning that this group's brought to them. So that's, I guess, some ideas about how you might do that in this group.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really interesting, because we were starting to think as well, if we do invite various partners, then maybe there are different activities within our community of practice that are more focused on the sub-program staff, and other activities more focused on some of our partners. So really thinking about our audience and recognizing that they might have different needs. So yes, that's been really helpful for thinking about how, if we wanted to invite specific external people at some point, we could do it through, say like a webinar like this, but very specifically with some specific messages, and possibly not while we're mulling things over, but once we have, sharing real findings or recommendations. So thank you. That's made me think we do need to think a bit more about the different audiences we might be trying to reach. So then actually thinking about how we do this practically, do you have any recommendations on, some of the things like how often we should meet? What have you seen that works best? Is it something more ad hoc, or say something quarterly? And how we do it? Should we maybe have specific topics within our broader question, which is about how to include the excluded in WASH decision making? Just some of the practicalities that that you've learned about. How should we do it, do you think, from your perspective?
I mean, I would say I'm not entirely sure of the lifespan of the project, but to keep people engaged and interested, you probably want to maybe do something like this every month if there's the appetite for it. But then I think in between that, if you do set up some more real-time learning platforms, then that would be a way people can engage every day, or whenever they like, and really try and keep it active. So I could imagine a scenario maybe where you have, and I think a number of thematic groups is probably interesting. Maybe you could do a quick survey with the group, like SurveyMonkey, to see if you can tease out some of the key learning themes, and then set up a Facebook or WhatsApp or Yammer or whatever to do that real time. And then every so often, maybe once a month, you come together and discuss one of the key themes and have different people, you know, sharing their learning. So that might be a way of sort of having a structured monthly, but then more sort of real-time learning in between. And I didn't mention DGroups, but I think that's something quite interesting to explore as well. If you had a number of themes on DGroups and you'd have a lead moderator on each one who, or coordinator if you like, who would like keep the conversation going and make sure that's being fed with the, but I think the real time is a good one to, for some of that raw learning to really feed in, because people find it much easier, I think, to quickly share, you know, a few ideas they had, or some photos or a quick video with somebody like that they'd met that day that, you know, that they were interacting with around this issue. So I think that's a way of not making it too heavy in the instant and capturing a lot of information. But as I say, it does then need that heavy work to synthesize it and make sense of it. And then you can use one of the other platforms to feed that in and share. So that's one way I think that you could do it.
That's great, thank you. So maybe finding out through something like a survey exactly which tools or which platforms people are most interested in using, and how frequently, and then build it around that. But as you say, each time making sure there's the coordination, the moderation to tease out the content and to bring it together as a package. But that's great. And it does like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So I was just going to say, you might find, you know, you might need to do it for a month to then sort of tease out what some of the themes are that are coming out, that you could then maybe separate into a few different streams.
Yes, yeah, I see what you mean. That makes sense.
Side, yeah. Mm.
Okay, great.
Sorry,
well,
I interrupted you.
No, that's no problem. So in the interest of time then, I'd just like to ask you one final question, which is around other challenges that you've faced when promoting this kind of learning amongst networks and groups that are based from across the world. What other kind of challenges have you faced so that we can learn from maybe what not to do as well?
Yeah, I mean, some of it, I mean, I think these platforms like this one have come on leaps and bounds. I mean, I see somebody there, Charles, there, even on video. So I think, but still the technology is a challenge, you know, getting a number of people to join a webinar from all over the world. I mean, this one's going very well, but I mean, I'm sure you've all been in them where people are dropping off and can't connect, and you've got an hour and you spend the first 10 to 15 minutes everyone joining, and some people can't log on. And so I think that's a real challenge. You guys have obviously, I think the way to overcome that is, you know, share the links early, ask people to test it, you know, send reminders, etc. The other thing I think is you know, time zones, people connecting at the right time, and terminology. Are we all speaking the same kind of language, and are we all on the same page about what we're talking about? I think that can sometimes, you know, the understanding of each other's context is what I mean. And then content-wise, it goes back to a little bit of a point that I made earlier. I think some of the challenges around that are about preparation. And so, as I said earlier, preparation for anything around learning should be as detailed as if you were organising something like a face-to-face seminar, because the results are really as good as the inputs. I think keep it focused, so that, you know, people very much understand what is the focus of the webinar or the learning platform and how they can engage, and maybe agree some basic rules of engagement so that that's very, very clear. And I think finally, I guess it's the obvious one of getting people to engage, keeping people interested. And for that, I would say maybe in this sort of webinar forum, keep presentations short, give enough space for dialogue, and maybe have amongst your wider network group there, have different champions and stewards, and ask people to take it in turns, to instigate the dialogue, to get involved in discussions, maybe get people to work together on a piece of learning and present it together. So really look at different ways of engaging the entire group, and that way I think you maybe keep people inspired and interested and engaged through the learning process.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I know I've actually kept you speaking for too long there, so didn't follow that advice where keeping a presentation short, but I had lots of questions
I realised
for
that
you.
as I was saying it.
No, but I did have lots of questions for you as well, and it's been so valuable to hear your experiences, and especially to hear those challenges so that we can adapt and learn from that. But I wanted to invite others on the call as well, on the webinar too, to see if they had any additional questions for you, or if there were any clarifications from what Ceridwen has said so far. And would anybody else like to ask a question, or perhaps to share a comment if it's not a question for Ceridwen?
Just a simple one. As understood, you can correct me if I'm wrong. WSSCC is a kind of network organization. How do you advise a kind of process or program, GESI program, which involves both implementation in learning than an organization which is focused more on network? Hello.
Okay. Hello, sorry, I didn't quite catch that question. Sorry, how do Tracey?
You mean, is it applicable or more feasible for an organization which is implementing at field level and at the same time trying to learn than an organization which is more focused on network? WSSCC is, I know because it's as an implementing in Ethiopia as well, it's more a network organization which involves a lot even in Ethiopia. So how do you advise us in terms of program implementation in the field, in the ground, and learning?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. Yes, no, that's a good point. And I think you do need to have the different types of platforms for, like you say, the different objectives. What I mentioned earlier, the real-time learning, the WhatsApp, for example, and I know that in a number of our GSF programs, the Global Sanitation Fund programs that do have programs into the community, they use the WhatsApp group, and some of them use the Facebook group, as I say, for more that capturing on a day-to-day, sharing photographs, sharing short videos, quick messages around learning that day. So I think that kind of learning certainly can work at program implementation level. I guess what we do at WSSCC is then we have the next level up where, you know, we are then taking the time to synthesize that and capture that and then digest it and then share it back in a different format. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Chimene. Anybody else got another question for Ceridwen? You can probably hear me scrolling around the system here. I am quite amazed how this works now. You're right about how far the technologies have advanced, Ceridwen, since we all started doing this kind of online learning. But I can't see anybody with their hand up or taking the mic just yet. So maybe what we'll do then is continue on with the rest of the conversation. And if additional questions do come to mind from anybody, please feel free to type them, whether they're to the rest of the group or to Ceridwen or to me, and we can continue having that conversation. But first of all, thank you so much, Ceridwen, again. Hopefully you can stay on with us while we move through the rest of the slides, or if you have any other thoughts for us at the end, then we'd very much appreciate it. But thank you so much. I can send you one little round of applause from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. I wish you all the best of luck and look forward to seeing the learning coming out of this programme.
Great, thank you. Actually, I have seen a question now just pop up just as I said that, which is from Ken, which says, "Hi, Ceridwen, have you ever had a case where you had to put in rules of conduct for participants?"
No, we haven't, but I mean, I did recommend that because I think just from my own experience, it's something that I thought of would be useful. I mean, certainly, as you know, with the more and more that we have sort of phishing and these sort of discussion forums where you have people making inappropriate comments, and yes, I think it's I think it's important to do that. I mean, we had one written on the community of practice. But I mean, I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure how many people looked at it, and we didn't have too many issues of conduct. But this is why I recommended it, because I think for a smaller group, you could maybe come up with your own rules of engagement, and you don't want to make it too heavy, but just some baseline rules that you agree to, and conduct could be part of that, I think. But yes, people being too polite. But yeah, anyway, I think I've answered that. But I not particularly, but I think it's a good idea to do something like that, light touch.
Mm-hmm. Great. It's an interesting point you raised there, Ken. So, for example, people could be being unhelpful or making strange comments, like Carida mentioned, or being too polite, which means they might not speak, perhaps, or might not want to share something, or may not feel as if the space is potentially safe enough to share something that went wrong. Perhaps, is it that kind of thing you're thinking about as well when it comes to being too polite?
I mean, just to pitch in again, I mean, that was one of the reasons why I was thinking around how you could have two individuals maybe preparing a presentation together, and then coming to like a forum like this and sharing it, because you can imagine, like, if you had that sort of rule, Ken, where you really ask them to share some of the challenges, for example, and they do it together, and then share it, not as an individual. That's a way that you might get some more honest learning around, you know, not just what goes well, but that doesn't go too well. And maybe you could even have a theme around that.
Great, that's a good idea. Yeah, thank you. Great. Okay, well, do keep typing questions. In the meantime, what I'll do is just move through the rest of the slides, just to bring it back to what we're thinking in terms of our own community of practice, and the purpose of it. You know, one of the reasons for it, as part of our broader global LKD package, is to be able to build our own capacities in GESI-focused programming. So the community of practice would build on that and provide a platform for peer-to-peer sharing, and obviously that opportunity to learn from each other, all with an effort to build our GESI capacities, but also perhaps our communications capacities. You know, for example, presenting in a webinar, like an online seminar like this, could be a really good experience for some who are not so used to speaking in public, for example. It's a very strange activity, speaking on a webinar, because you often feel like you're talking to yourself, even though there might be lots of people online. And it's a strange piece, but I would say, having done some myself, I've learned a lot about how to do it and how to communicate a little bit differently in these online fora, but also has helped me with face-to-face ones too. So maybe we could all figure out through this community of practice how to help build our communications as well as our GESI capacities. And of course, we want to use this space or this platform as an opportunity to discuss specific ideas and methods for improving GESI WASH programming. So maybe that's where some of the tools like a WhatsApp group or thematic DGroups that unpick some of the different sub-themes that we're all working on could be really useful, so that we have a lot of the practical and specific ideas for how to improve our programming. So that was really what we thought the purpose of the community of practice was. And then what do we want it to look like? And you'll have seen these images before. You know, when Sue and I were talking to everybody about how they would want this learning and knowledge development component of the program to work, it was very clear that people wanted it to be very evidence-based and accessible, as well as being practitioner and very practical, and practitioner focused. So we would want to make sure that everything we do through the community of practice builds on that. Maybe there are some of these initial simple ground rules as well. You know, we know that these are the things that we want to keep in mind, and we want to be as evidence-based and practical as we can. But then again, we know everybody's busy. So on the right-hand side of this slide, it's optional. People can choose to engage in whichever bits of the community of practice and the different activities and tools that we use, based on their own availability and their own interests. But we will try to ensure everything is participatory and is inclusive as it can be, and constructive. but finally, and most importantly, that it's peer-to-peer. So normally, I think it won't be a case of, say, me talking all the time and interviewing Ceridwen all the time, things like this. It would be all of us participating. And I liked what Ceridwen suggested about having potentially different people in the different places, in different sub-programs, potentially being a champion for different sub-themes, or maybe just doing a one-off webinar in collaboration with another sub-program, for example, so that we really do make sure it's peer-to-peer and as participatory as we can. And so then finally I thought, well, how could it work? I tried to think a little bit more about this as well. You know, we've heard some great ideas from Ceridwen. We can have an online platform. We could have monthly or quarterly webinars that build up, that focus on conversations and topics that have built up on WhatsApp or on another platform, so that we can continue sharing. Or we could have a calendar where different sub-programs share on a specific sub-theme that's of interest to them, or a lesson that they've had from trying a particular GESI-focused approach. We can attach those kind of online platforms to the more informal ad hoc sharing of news, research and events, like Ceridwen was saying, through things like WhatsApp and LinkedIn groups. And we can consider using different software tools as well. This is often, I've personally found, one of the hardest things to get going, that using something like a tool that captures all the content in one place, that has a calendar where you can have emails. I don't know if you've used any of these, like Slack or Trello, which they are amazing, but it's very, very hard to get people to all use them. So we could maybe find another way to perhaps have like an online calendar where we share ideas about what's happening when and where, and to share documents. Like Ceridwen mentioned, I think having a central repository or a space where we can keep all of our documents and products and videos, that is something that could be really useful. So we can think about the best tools or platforms to do that. And another point that Ceridwen raised is to capture some of the emerging findings, so the outputs, so we can hope to have some briefing notes. And of course, for us, we have the luxury of being able to link this community of practice learning with the potential for having some face-to-face learning events over the next 2 years. So what we can try to do is to link all of these things together, so that we have a package of activities. So that's how we thought it could work. I mean, is there anybody online who'd like to share their own example of being in one of these kinds of learning groups, and to share what they found really worked well, or perhaps to find what didn't work so well, and to see if we can also hear from others and, you know, their experiences to help shape ours? Would anybody like to share their own experience? Perhaps I can also request, I think it's SNV, haven't you used these DGroups as well before in the past? Have you got experience of that?
Sharon left the conversation.
Oh, Sharon disappeared. Right. Okay. We can't.
I mean, I've used DGroups in the past, and I think they are helpful, because you can very quickly get a question on an answer, an answer on a question that you have about a very specific thing, like, oh, does anyone have any experience with this tool, or how did you overcome this? So I think it works. I don't know if it needs to be a D group or just an email exchange. I guess with a D group you can decide how often you get an email or something. But the challenge is, of course, that you get overwhelmed by the answers. But it's also a way of maybe starting to make connections with peers that, you know, over time you might feel like, oh, actually that person is really helpful, so I go directly to that person rather than putting it into the entire group.
No, thanks, Jose. That is a good point. We need to make sure that we find that right balance between having good, constructive, considered conversations, but also not overwhelming everybody with the content and the response. So that will be something I think we need to be constantly aware of. I see, as well, there was another point raised by Ava, which asks a similar thing. If any of the participants online have experience with communities of practice using different methodologies or tools that Caridwen didn't mention that you might like to share. Has anybody used anything else for this type of learning? Kumbalani, were you just about to say something, or was that just the mic appearing and then disappearing? I know you might have your big group link there. So thank you. Please go ahead.
Good morning. We're the Zambia group again.
Hello. Good morning, everybody.
We joined late in the session. We've just heard that you are discussing about the platforms for communication. Yes, in SMV we've used the DGroups. And the information has been exchanged through emails. But the important thing is that there must be somebody who consolidates what is being shared, so that maybe after some time this discussion is synthesized and there is an output. So that's how it was worked. So it varies again on the topics. In some topics the participation has been very good, in others maybe less, and so on. But I think the important thing is to have someone who will coordinate and consolidate, synthesize, and then consolidate what comes out of the various discussions.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kumbalani. And for everybody else, I should mention that Kumbalani is having a 2-day workshop. I think there's 25 of them together from 5 different towns in Zambia, having a 2-day workshop on how to do their GESI and knowledge learning development activities. So thank you all for joining and for fitting in the webinar into your agenda. We really, really do appreciate it. Okay, so is there any other thoughts from others? If you've used any other tools, I mean, we've heard some good suggestions there of, making sure we don't overwhelm people. As Kumbalani was saying, making sure there is somebody actively synthesizing discussions, consolidating and synthesizing, recognizing that on some topics there may be more participation than on others. I wondered did anybody else want to make a comment or add anything on that?
I have a question maybe for some of the SMV participants who are still there, even though I saw Sharon had gone. So the DGroups that SMV has, are they still active? And so I'm just trying to think, rather than reinventing the wheels, I mean, are there existing communities of practice that we could join rather than developing a kind of a new parallel system? And it could be the DGroups from SMV, but it could be the Susanna groups that were just mentioned. Or do we think our issues are so specific that we have to kind of do it as a large SDG group, or is it just because then it's a smaller group and people can get to know each other better?
Yeah, it's a good point. A good question, Jose. Is there anybody, I know Sanya and a few others are here from SMV, but do you know if those DGroups are still working or if they're still set up?
The DGroups are dependent on an event. For example, we have a learning event, say, once per year, and then depending on that topic, prior to the learning event, we have the DGroup discussions. And those discussions build up to the agenda for that particular learning event. So they are specific, they are linked to a particular topic.
Okay, that's a really good idea as well, actually. Thanks, Kumbalani. So it's more related to specific activities, specific events, and it helps build up the agenda and the discussions. Okay, No, that's good to know. And what we can do also is ask a little bit more to those that are already using them to see if there are existing ones that we can use, or if not, potentially, as Cavill was mentioning, maybe approach the Rural Water Supply Network or Susanna to see if there are some of theirs we could use. Obviously, we do want our own internal one, but I think that's how perhaps it works. Unless Cavill or Sue, do you know more about how they work and how we could build on what others have already developed?
I think we could participate in the seminar series, for like the one Cavill was mentioning, or the RWSN ones. They have a theme on equity and inclusion as well. Although Cavill was saying, could explain perhaps a bit more about how they're combining with the Susanna. But yeah, I think we could use our group to decide feed into those discussions.
Yeah, absolutely, Sue. I agree. I mean, obviously, there's value in this smaller group, but feeding in the learning into the discussion to the wider sector, I think, you know, through the Susanna subcategory on equity and inclusion would be a great idea, because they've just developed an editorial calendar. Sue, just to be clear, it's not webinars, but it's times where there will be an online discussion. So they set times, and I mean, you're very welcome to share what I shared with you to this group. So there's a couple of dates that are on gender specifically, for example. So if you are ready to share and input some learning through that, and that might also hit the sort of advocacy or part of an advocacy strategy that you have as well, getting some of the learning and the messages out to a wider group and influencing the sector more widely. But feel free to share that, because we're very keen, you know, this is a new subcategory, to get lots of engagement and new learning around equity and inclusion through that Susanna subcategory. With the D groups, not so engaged, but I know that they're very, very open at RWSN, and I'm sure they'd be delighted to hear from you and ready to explore any proposals that you might have for them.
Great. Okay, no, thanks everybody. So it sounds like, in terms of next steps, what we'll do is put together a survey, perhaps for everybody, a very simple survey where people can just tick the boxes to see which type of tool and platform they would be interested in using and the frequency of using those. So how, you know, is it a monthly or is it quarterly type of exchange, or is this a set of different activities? So we'll put together a very brief survey for everybody, just so that we have consensus and see what to use there. And I'll also share what Cavill just referred to with the Susanna WSSCC editorial timeline for that new group on equity and inclusion. So with that, I think we've come to the end of our time. But if you do want to ask any other questions, please do send me an email, and I can also coordinate with Cavill. Of course, if I can answer the question myself, I will do my best. But I just wanted to thank you all for participating today, especially Cavill for being interviewed, being grilled on her experience of working in this area. So thanks to everybody. And if you do have questions, as I said, please do keep in touch, and you'll hear from me soon with next steps and the survey. So thanks everybody, and bye for now.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Thank you, Charles.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks,
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.